Take a moment and look down at the ground under you. It seems stable, reliable, like something that will always be there. But in reality, that sense of permanence is one of the biggest illusions in real estate history. What we're seeing right now is essentially a slow-motion theft, and the unusual part is that the thief is geology itself, while the people being hit are homeowners locked into 30-year mortgages on land that may not even physically hold together for that long. The warning signs are already there, buried in satellite readings and buried even deeper in official municipal reports. Documents that rarely get attention because they sit behind polished marketing materials from developers promising dream homes and ocean views. The irony is that those ocean views are often getting closer for a very different reason. The ground beneath many coastal cities is gradually sinking. Entire concrete-heavy urban areas are settling downward into the earth, while sea levels are simultaneously rising. After going through geological surveys, insurance risk models, and long-term financial projections, the outlook is honestly alarming. It becomes important to understand which housing markets are already starting to fail before committing to any long-term property decisions. The data connected to the city sitting at the very top of this list, known for its vibrant nightlife, suggests it could become effectively unlivable within a human lifetime. Meanwhile, the major economic hub ranked third is literally compressing under its own structural load. Now, let's open the file and look at what the evidence actually shows. Number 10 is Seattle, Washington. The so-called Emerald City looks almost deceptively stable at first glance, but underneath that image is a far more complicated geological situation. Most people think of the region in terms of constant rain, evergreen scenery, and coffee culture. Yet the real action is happening far below the surface, where massive tectonic plates are slowly grinding against each other in a quiet, ongoing struggle. What makes Seattle especially interesting in this investigation is that it isn't sinking evenly like some Gulf Coast regions. Instead, different pockets of the city are experiencing uneven vertical land movement, which puts stress on infrastructure in very specific and unpredictable ways. Local climate assessments suggest that by around 2050, relative sea levels in the area could rise by more than 10 inches. On paper, that might not sound dramatic, but the real impact becomes much clearer when you map it against existing development patterns and high-value coastal real estate. Research from the University of Washington shows that thousands of acres, covering both industrial zones and residential neighborhoods, sit directly in areas vulnerable to tidal flooding and future inundation risks. This isn't just about occasional water in basements. It points to a gradual breakdown in how usable and stable the land itself remains over time. The city's port districts, which serve as a major economic engine, are especially exposed. According to findings from the National Research Council, the combination of sinking land in reclaimed or filled areas and steadily rising sea levels creates a layered flood risk that many insurance models still don't properly reflect. On top of that, during king tide events, water levels are already pushing against or surpassing historical benchmarks. Over the last century, sea levels in Seattle have already risen by roughly 9 inches, and the concerning part is that the rate of change is no longer steady, it's accelerating. What's happening here is a gradual, almost invisible buildup of risk. It doesn't feel sudden. It happens in tiny increments, millimeters at a time, until infrastructure like drainage systems starts to fail under pressure. At the same time, the city sits on a geological fault line near the Cascadia subduction zone, meaning seismic activity remains an additional long-term risk factor. That creates a situation where potential sudden ground shifts could combine with the slower process of rising sea levels and land subsidence. When those forces are layered together, the result is a real estate environment that could face sharp and unforgiving corrections in the future. Despite this, much of the market is still primarily valuing Seattle property based on tech industry growth and economic expansion, while underestimating the long-term geological pressure being placed on its waterfront areas along Puget Sound. Number 9 is San Francisco, California. This area provides one of the clearest, most striking examples uncovered in this investigation. You've probably already heard about the Millennium Tower, a high-end skyscraper that has famously sunk by nearly 18 inches and developed a noticeable tilt since it was completed. But what's important is that this building isn't some isolated failure. It's really just a visible warning sign of a much wider issue affecting the entire Bay Area. The ground beneath much of San Francisco is inherently unstable. Large portions of its most valuable real estate were actually built on reclaimed land, including landfill, soft mud, and former marshes, materials that are highly vulnerable to compaction and liquefaction under pressure. What this creates is a situation where the land is literally settling in the exact same areas where property values are at their peak. It's a direct overlap between economic importance and geological instability. A study published in Science Advances used satellite radar data to track this movement and found that parts of the Treasure Island development are sinking at rates of up to 10 millimeters per year. In geological terms, that is a significant and relatively fast rate of subsidence. Even major infrastructure is not exempt. San Francisco International Airport, which sits on reclaimed marshland, is also showing measurable signs of sinking. That means critical transportation infrastructure is gradually moving closer to sea level, adding long-term operational risk. According to projections from the United States Geological Survey, between roughly 42,000 and nearly 500,000 people in the Bay Area could be displaced by the combined effects of rising sea levels and ongoing land subsidence by the end of the century. The financial exposure is enormous, with estimates suggesting more than $100 billion in property value is at risk from persistent or recurring flooding conditions. What makes this even more severe is that local subsidence doesn't just add to global sea level rise, it intensifies it in specific neighborhoods, effectively multiplying the impact. In other words, this is a double-layered threat. The ocean is rising globally while the ground itself is also dropping locally. Protecting this coastline would require massive seawall and flood defense projects costing billions of dollars, expenses that would ultimately be passed down to both taxpayers and property owners over time. At its core, the pattern is fairly straightforward. Much of the city was built by filling in parts of the bay, and now those artificial expansions are gradually being reclaimed by natural processes. So if someone owns property on reclaimed land in the Bay Area, they're essentially holding an asset whose foundation is slowly shifting and sliding back toward the Pacific over time, turning what looks like a stable investment into a long-term geological risk. Number 8 is Charleston, South Carolina. The historic beauty of this place is undeniable at first sight, but just beneath the cobblestone streets lies a much more serious and concerning reality. Charleston is increasingly being viewed as a kind of early warning signal for the broader Atlantic coastline. What the data shows is that the city is gradually sinking, driven by a mix of natural soil compaction in the underlying sediments and ongoing groundwater extraction. Together, these forces create a clear example of subsidence that intensifies the impacts of rising sea levels and climate change. Information from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration shows a sharp rise in tidal flooding events since the 1970s. The city is now experiencing a growing number of days where seawater pushes into urban streets, not during storms or hurricanes, but simply during routine high tides, especially when lunar cycles intensify them. Over the past century, local sea levels have risen by more than a foot in Charleston, and that rate is noticeably higher than the global average. The key reason isn't just ocean expansion, but the fact that the land itself is steadily sinking, amplifying the effect. City projections suggest that if current trends continue and no effective adaptation is implemented, nearly half of the Charleston Peninsula could be exposed to regular high-tide flooding within the next 50 years. That shifts the situation from occasional inconvenience to long-term habitability risk. From a real estate perspective, the market is increasingly operating under pressure. Areas that were once considered stable and desirable are now being reclassified into repetitive loss zones, reflecting their ongoing exposure to flood damage. At the same time, the cost of defending the historic district is staggering. Estimates for a proposed seawall exceed $1.1 billion, raising a difficult question about public funding being used to protect privately owned coastal property. On top of that, analysis from the First Street Foundation indicates that thousands of properties may soon fall into categories where insurance becomes extremely limited or even unavailable due to persistent flood risk. Another major issue is groundwater and drainage. The water table is already so high that the soil struggles to absorb rainfall properly, which leads to frequent flash flooding. These events can weaken building foundations and accelerate the decay of structural materials like wood. In a broader sense, what's happening in Charleston is more than just periodic flooding of streets or yards. It reflects a deeper structural shift, where a city originally built on marshland is gradually being reclaimed by the same environmental conditions it was built upon, now intensified by modern climate pressures. Number 7 is Annapolis, Maryland. It's somewhat ironic that the home of the United States Naval Academy is itself struggling against rising water levels. What this investigation reveals is a growing pattern known as nuisance flooding, basically a softened term for something much more disruptive, where seawater regularly interferes with everyday movement, business activity, and urban life. Part of the problem is geological. The land in this region is gradually sinking due to a process called glacial isostatic adjustment. In simple terms, areas that were once pushed down by massive ice sheets in the north are now slowly rebounding upward, which in turn causes regions farther south, like Annapolis, to tilt downward slightly, almost like a seesaw effect. Research from the University of Maryland indicates that sea level rise in this harbor is occurring at nearly twice the global average. That difference becomes especially significant when translated into real-world flooding impacts over time. Historical data shows just how quickly conditions have changed. Since the 1950s, the number of flood days in the area has increased by more than 900%. For anyone in commercial real estate, that kind of shift signals a serious long-term risk trend. Key areas of the city are already affected. The historic city dock, which serves as both a cultural landmark and a commercial hub, is frequently inundated during high-tide events, disrupting tourism and local business activity. Even major institutions are not insulated from these changes. The United States Naval Academy has identified portions of its campus that are increasingly vulnerable to rising water levels, and protecting those areas will require hundreds of millions of dollars in long-term infrastructure investment. The economic effects are already starting to show. A study from Stanford University found that tidal flooding has contributed to a measurable decline in downtown visitation, around 2%, which translates directly into lost revenue for nearby businesses. Over time, this creates a compounding effect on property values. If commercial streets are regularly underwater, business activity slows, leases lose value, and entire sections of the local economy begin to weaken. Residential areas are also feeling the pressure. As storm drains begin to back up with saltwater intrusion, basic infrastructure becomes less reliable, and the day-to-day usability of waterfront homes declines. What's emerging is a gradual but unmistakable transformation of the city. In some areas, the situation is progressing to the point where normal transportation could eventually require boats during high water events, just to reach basic services like grocery stores. Overall, what was once considered occasional nuisance flooding is steadily evolving into a structural threat, and the real estate market is still struggling to fully account for the long-term reality of a city slowly giving way to the water. Number 6 is Virginia Beach, Virginia. On the surface, this is a classic coastal vacation hotspot, the kind of place people associate with long boardwalks, tourism, and oceanfront hotels. But beneath that familiar image, there's a quieter and far more serious story unfolding that most visitors never notice. The investigation points to a rather unusual combination of factors. One is the presence of an ancient meteor impact structure buried beneath the region, an event that occurred roughly 35 million years ago. Over time, the land has gradually settled into the sediments of this old impact crater, creating a naturally unstable geological foundation that is difficult to fully stabilize through engineering alone. On top of that, modern activity has made things worse. Continuous groundwater extraction for municipal and industrial needs is effectively drawing water out from underground layers, causing the surface to slowly compact and sink over time. Together, these processes create a kind of gradual deflation effect, similar to air leaking from a tire. Data from the United States Geological Survey shows that parts of the region are sinking at a rate of several millimeters per year. That may not sound dramatic in isolation, but when stretched across the timeline of a typical 30-year mortgage, it becomes a meaningful structural change to the land itself. Research suggests that subsidence in this area accounts for nearly half of the relative sea level rise being observed locally. In other words, it's not just the ocean coming up, it's also the ground actively moving downward at the same time. Forecasts from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration indicate that sea levels in this region could rise by as much as 7 feet by 2100 under worst-case climate scenarios. That level of change would place billions of dollars worth of residential and hotel infrastructure at serious risk of long-term or permanent flooding. The broader Hampton Roads region, which includes Virginia Beach, is actually one of the most exposed population centers in the United States when it comes to sea level rise risk, second only to New Orleans. Thousands of homes are already located in zones that experience annual or recurring flooding, gradually shifting entire neighborhoods into semi-aquatic conditions. Even critical military infrastructure in the area is affected, adding a strategic dimension to the issue. If base operations are disrupted by flooding, the local economy would feel the impact quickly, which in turn would directly affect regional property values. At the same time, the beaches that attract millions of tourists each year are constantly fighting erosion, requiring ongoing and costly sand replenishment just to maintain their current shape and usability. When you put all of this together, it paints a clear picture. Parts of Virginia Beach are effectively sitting on a slow-moving conveyor belt toward the Atlantic. The scenery remains attractive, but the underlying foundation is steadily weakening. From an investment perspective, the concern is that many buyers are focusing on the coastal appeal while underestimating the long-term geological and environmental forces that are quietly reshaping the stability of the entire shoreline. Number 5 is Galveston, Texas. If there's a place that looks like a crime scene where the coastline itself is the victim, this barrier island fits that description almost perfectly. It has always had a difficult relationship with the ocean, but what's happening now is more subtle and far more persistent. A slow-moving threat that doesn't usually make headlines until the damage is already done. The investigation shows that long-term groundwater extraction in the past caused deep clay layers beneath the city to compact in a way that cannot be reversed. Even though pumping has been reduced or regulated today, the structural impact on the land's elevation is already permanent. As a result, much of the island has gradually sunk over the past century, leaving it significantly lower and far more exposed to the advancing Gulf of Mexico than it used to be. Reports from the Texas General Land Office reveal that in some areas, the shoreline is retreating at an average rate of more than 4 feet per year. In practical terms, that means land is literally vanishing, and with it, the legal boundaries of properties are being pulled inland over time. Every inch of subsidence also increases how destructive storm surges can become. Even the city's famous seawall, while helpful, is no longer a complete defense system because water is now pushing in from the bayside as well, effectively going around traditional coastal protections. A study by the Union of Concerned Scientists estimates that thousands of homes on Galveston Island could face regular or chronic flooding conditions by around 2045, especially during storm events and high tides. From a financial perspective, the insurance situation is becoming increasingly strained. Premiums are rising sharply as actuarial models are forced to adjust to the physical reality of a sinking coastline and more frequent flooding. In fact, a significant portion of the local real estate market is effectively sustained through federal flood insurance support. Without that backing, property values would likely adjust downward very quickly. The broader local economy, which depends heavily on tourism and shipping activity, is also vulnerable. Both sectors are sensitive to disruptions caused by rising water levels and infrastructure strain. Road networks already show signs of stress, with drainage systems frequently overwhelmed during heavy rainfall because the natural slope of the land has been altered by subsidence. This turns routine storms into major transportation disruptions. Ultimately, this is a place where weather is only part of the equation. The deeper issue is geological. Buyers aren't just dealing with storms, they're dealing with a shifting foundation. In that sense, purchasing property here becomes a long-term risk bet where natural forces consistently tilt the outcome in one direction. The market, in many ways, is being held together by optimism and external financial support, while the underlying physics of erosion continue to work against it. Number 4 is Houston, Texas. The evidence surrounding this massive metro area is extensive, and it points to a large-scale pattern of environmental and structural strain that has developed over decades. Houston is one of the clearest and most intense examples of subsidence in the United States. For many years, the city extracted enormous volumes of groundwater from deep underground aquifers to support its rapid growth, especially during its expansion tied to the oil and industrial sectors. Over time, this caused the soil layers to compress, and in some areas the city has effectively sunk more than 10 feet since the 1920s. That figure isn't an exaggeration. It reflects real, measurable elevation loss. Data from the United States Geological Survey confirms this ongoing decline and classifies it as one of the most significant subsidence events recorded in the country. Although regulatory districts were later introduced to limit groundwater pumping, the land itself continues to adjust and settle from the damage that has already been done. The movement hasn't stopped. it has simply slowed and become more uneven. One of the major consequences is that floodplain maps have had to be redrawn almost entirely. Areas that were previously considered low risk are now effectively acting like shallow basins, where heavy rainfall has nowhere efficient to drain. This became especially evident during Hurricane Harvey, when the combination of extreme rainfall and reduced drainage capacity due to sinking land contributed to catastrophic flooding. The storm ultimately caused around $125 billion in damages, making it one of the costliest disasters in U.S. history. Further analysis shows that more than 30,000 square miles of land in the broader region have experienced at least 1 foot of subsidence, highlighting how widespread the issue has become beyond just isolated neighborhoods. The physical effects are also showing up in everyday infrastructure. Roads, pipelines, and building foundations are under constant stress from uneven ground movement, leading to cracking, shifting, and long-term maintenance challenges known as differential settlement. From a real estate perspective, this creates an unstable environment where flood risk and land movement are constantly changing. In many ways, pricing and zoning feel like a gamble because the underlying conditions are no longer static. A report from the Texas Living Waters Project adds another layer to the problem. Ongoing urban development has reduced wetlands and increased paved surfaces, which prevents rainwater from naturally being absorbed back into the ground and recharging aquifers. This, in turn, worsens both flooding and subsidence over time. In effect, the city's expansion has unintentionally reinforced the very conditions that destabilize it. Large-scale concrete development limits natural water cycles, which contributes to further ground movement and drainage problems. What emerges is a sprawling urban system that is slowly settling back into the soft, water-rich soils it was built on. The result is a gradual but persistent decline in stability, where property values are increasingly influenced not just by location or market trends, but by underlying geological shifts. The real cost of living in this environment often shows up indirectly, through repeated foundation repairs, rising insurance premiums, and ongoing flood-related expenses that steadily increase the financial burden on homeowners over time. Number 3 is New York City, New York. The Big Apple carries a hidden weight problem that goes far beyond economics, and it may quietly threaten the very foundation of its global dominance. One major study published in the journal Earth's Future argues that the city is effectively sinking under the enormous load of its own infrastructure and development. When you add it all together, New York is pressing down on its ground with roughly 1.68 trillion pounds of concrete, steel, and glass. That immense load is not just symbolic, it has measurable physical effects. On average, the city is settling by about 1 to 2 millimeters per year, though certain neighborhoods are sinking faster depending on soil conditions and underlying composition. Individually, that rate sounds minor. But when it is combined with rising sea levels, it becomes a much more serious long-term issue that gradually increases flood exposure across large parts of the city. Data from the Federal Emergency Management Agency shows that sea levels around Manhattan have already risen by roughly 9 inches since 1950. That shift alone has significantly changed the city's coastal risk profile. One of the most vulnerable systems is the subway network, which is essentially the backbone of New York's real estate value and daily function. When tunnels flood, the damage goes far beyond temporary disruption. Saltwater intrusion is especially destructive because it corrodes electrical systems, including switches and signaling infrastructure. Repairing that kind of damage can cost billions and take significant time to fully restore. Lower Manhattan stands out as a particularly high-risk zone, with large concentrations of extremely valuable real estate now sitting in flood-prone areas that continue to expand over time. The issue isn't uniform across the city either. Research shows that clay-rich areas like parts of Brooklyn and Queens are compressing more than regions built on bedrock. This uneven settling leads to structural strain, which can result in cracked facades, shifting foundations, and long-term building damage. Over time, this creates a situation where certain property types, especially basement units and ground-floor commercial spaces, may become increasingly difficult to insure or maintain economically. According to projections from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, sea levels in the region could rise by as much as 30 inches by the 2050s, further increasing flood risk across key districts. The financial district, which functions as one of the most important economic centers in the world, is therefore facing a long-term environmental challenge that directly intersects with its economic importance. What makes the situation particularly striking is the contrast. Some of the highest real estate values on the planet exist directly above ground that is slowly shifting downward, while surrounding water levels continue to rise. In effect, this creates a long-term tension between immovable skyscrapers and an advancing ocean system. From an investment standpoint, it becomes a fundamental bet on whether engineering and infrastructure can permanently outpace natural forces like gravity, subsidence, and sea level rise, a historical gamble that rarely remains balanced indefinitely. Number 2 is Miami, Florida. If there is a central point for what many would call a coastal real estate bubble, this city is often seen as the clearest example. The situation here is especially alarming because of what lies beneath it, a foundation of porous limestone. That geology changes everything. Our investigation shows that traditional seawalls offer only limited protection in this environment, because water doesn't just come from the ocean's edge. It can move underneath the ground itself and resurface through storm drains, yards, and low-lying streets. This is what leads to the so-called sunny day flooding, where streets can become inundated with salt water, even when the weather is completely clear, with no rain or storm activity at all. It creates a strange and unsettling contrast between normal surface conditions and hidden water intrusion below. Data from the World Resources Institute highlights just how exposed this region is, identifying it as one of the largest concentrations of vulnerable coastal assets anywhere in the world. In financial terms, this means hundreds of billions of dollars in property sitting on a highly permeable, water-sensitive foundation. Sea level rise in the area is also not static. It is accelerating. Observations over the past decade show measurable increases in ocean levels that are already affecting flood frequency and intensity. To respond, the city has invested heavily in pump systems designed to push water out of streets and neighborhoods. These projects cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but they are effectively working against the broader pressure of the Atlantic Ocean pushing inward. Some market projections, including analysis referenced by Zillow, suggest that nearly half of the homes in the region could face chronic inundation or severe flooding conditions by the end of the century. That kind of outcome represents a massive potential loss of long-term wealth for many homeowners. At the same time, the insurance sector is already adjusting in a very aggressive way. Premiums are rising sharply, and in some cases companies are reducing or completely withdrawing coverage in parts of the state because the long-term risk becomes difficult to price. Another growing concern is saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers. As seawater pushes further inland underground, it threatens the quality and reliability of drinking water sources for millions of residents. From a practical standpoint, purchasing property in this environment is less like acquiring stable land and more like holding a temporary position on a shifting sandbar that is gradually being reshaped by ocean forces. While the skyline still reflects wealth and luxury, the underlying physical reality tells a different story. One where water is already present beneath the surface and the limestone foundation provides very little resistance. Overall, this makes Miami one of the most structurally vulnerable real estate markets in the country, where much of its perceived value depends not just on demand, but on a growing gap between appearance and geological reality. Number 1 is New Orleans, Louisiana. This is the most critical entry in the entire investigation and, in many ways, represents the worst-case scenario for coastal real estate in the United States. The data tells a troubling story of a city that is slowly but steadily losing ground. In some areas, subsidence rates reach up to around 2 inches per decade, which becomes especially significant when viewed over longer time periods. According to NASA studies that use radar-based measurements, the city is sinking faster than previously understood, largely due to a combination of soft soil compression, drainage of wetland systems, and complex underground geological movement. The result is a bowl-shaped landscape where large portions of the city sit below sea level, entirely dependent on an extensive system of levees and water management infrastructure to remain habitable. Without that engineered protection, much of the area would naturally be exposed to surrounding water systems. The broader numbers reinforce the severity of the situation. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration classifies this region as one of the highest rates of relative sea level rise in the world. Since the 1930s, approximately 2,000 square miles of surrounding land, an area roughly comparable to the size of Delaware, has been lost to water permanently. Much of the natural wetland buffer that once protected the city from storm surges has also disappeared over time. As that protective layer erodes, the urban core becomes increasingly exposed to the full force of Gulf weather systems and rising tides. Current estimates suggest that nearly half of the city already sits below sea level, which places extraordinary pressure on the pumping systems and levees that keep water out. As subsidence continues, those systems must work harder each year, requiring more energy and higher maintenance costs just to maintain basic habitability. Federal Emergency Management Agency flood maps are also constantly being updated to reflect this changing reality, and those updates often push homeowners into higher-risk insurance categories, significantly increasing financial pressure on residents. In practical terms, large parts of the city already exist in a condition that would naturally be underwater without continuous human intervention. The only reason it remains dry is because of a heavily engineered water control system, which itself carries a long history of strain and vulnerability. This creates a long-term structural contradiction. The geography naturally trends toward submersion, while human infrastructure continuously fights to hold that line. The cost of maintaining that balance increases over time as the ground continues to settle. From an investment perspective, this is one of the clearest examples of a location where environmental forces and engineered defenses are locked in constant tension with no permanent resolution in sight. More broadly, the investigation as a whole points to a larger shift in how coastal real estate must be understood. These cities are not just reacting to storms or isolated weather events. They are responding to long-term physical changes in land and sea dynamics that operate on geological timescales.